All right, welcome everyone. We have Frank Kelly joining us. He's the Head of Government and Public Affairs Americas at Deutsche Bank. He's got a lot to tell us. There's been a bit going on this week. Quick housekeeping matter first. Over the next couple of weeks, Michelle will be sending out some emails in which we're looking for potential volunteers. There's a couple of opportunities to promote the society to students, including the Student Investment Management Portfolio, as well as the Student Career Day, as well as doing some profiles of people who are CFA Society members to talk about career prospects for students. So there's going to be a couple of opportunities to devote some time promoting our society to students. So the key point is, don't delete that email, read it, respond to what Michelle has to say, and then people have a chance to get involved. So with that out of the way, Frank Kelly has a lot to tell us. As we go, he is delighted to take questions within the ongoing proceedings, and I'm going to interrupt him with questions as they come. So there's a question and answer feature on the website. So pose your questions and I'll try to find the right time to interrupt and answer those questions. Please take it away, Frank.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks everybody for joining today. And seriously, I think more interactive, the better, and hopefully more use to you. So just pile on the questions. Jason will just flag me. I can see them, and we'll take it from there. So here we are, a week since the election, and I think it's quite clear that we do have President-elect Joe Biden, though President Trump, of course, is fighting this, litigating this, seeking recounts, which I think is annoying a lot of people, but I think everybody just needs to take a deep breath. Everything he's doing is within the law and what he can do. I think, quite frankly, it's not going to change the outcome of the election, but it is what it is, and we will have a transfer of power on January 20th, when President-elect Biden is sworn into office at noon. It will be very interesting to say, as a footnote, and I was chatting with Jason before the call, what happens the next 3 weeks, and do we, as we're hearing rumors of, that President Trump announces his intention to run for re-election in 2024 in the next 3 weeks, once he realizes he's exhausted the courts and the recounts and nothing happens. That'll be interesting. And so we'll see how that plays out. I'm happy to take questions on what the scenarios, what that means for the Republican Party over the next 4 years. It'll be interesting. From a market perspective, I find that people have been particularly focused on the Senate, though I think the House is very interesting too, and the outcome there, which the media has sort of overlooked and has big implications. It really comes down to what the agenda for the next 2 years are going to be, or certainly the next 2 years until the midterm elections. Who controls the U.S. Senate? Currently, there are 3 Senate seats that are still open, Alaska and the 2 Georgia Senate seats. Alaska's are going to be Republican. I think they're probably preparing to call that today. And the delay is because it's Alaska, right? It's half the size of the continental United States, and they are literally flying boats in off of bush planes and any other means. I wouldn't be surprised if you got dog sleds bringing boats into Juneau and Anchorage. So it always takes a lot of time there, but I think the Republican wins. It's the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, which is an anomaly because, of course, we know you never see both seats for the Senate for any state come up in the same year. Just to remind people, there was a senator who stepped down for health reasons 2 years ago. The governor appointed a replacement, Kelly Loeffler, and she had to run for re-election within 2 years, which coincided with the regularly scheduled other Senate seat. So this is going to be battle royale over the next 2 months, and you guys can't imagine the amount of money that's going to be spent on that, because it will decide who controls the Senate. I think Republicans are on track and likely to win at least one of the 2, and if they do, then they have a 51 vote majority. I think it's more likely they actually win both, but we'll see. It's still, this is 2020 and time moves slowly and events move fast. So let's see if there's any flip to that, which sets up an interesting dynamic legislatively: a Biden presidency, a Republican Senate, and then a House of Representatives. As I mentioned, people sort of missed it. Democrats expected to win going into this 12 to 15 seats, net seats. And weirdly, contrary to what everybody thought, it went the complete opposite way. Republicans look like they're on track to win 10 to 15 seats net. This has created a lot of friction over the last week in the House of Representatives. People, progressive left, attacking the Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi and others, the centrist Democrats attacking Pelosi and the progressive left, saying you cost us these seats. But what it's done is seriously compressed the differential between Democrats and Republicans. I think it's going to be like a 10, 12 seat differential for control. Republicans see an opportunity to seize control if they can pull it off in 2022. But this has been something of more than something of a blow to Nancy Pelosi. Arguably, I would say somebody I've watched closely, worked with closely on legislation for 30 years. She's one of the smartest legislators I've ever seen in Washington. And her final 2 years, she's a lame duck. She's had already agreed at the beginning of 2018 to step down as speaker at the end of 2022 as the number 2 in the party, as the number 3 in the party in the House. So you're going to see this hockey line change of 3 people out, 3 people in, and others, and which means you're a lame duck. You're weakened by the election, and now you're going to see over the next 3 to 6 months, I would predict, a number of the younger, much younger members sort of now putting themselves out and starting to campaign for those who's going to be the next speaker, who's going to be the number 2, who's going to be the number 3. So it's interesting. What that does is it drives them to the center, and the centrists are on the ascendancy in the House. All told, if you take that sort of, what am I aligning here, is Joe Biden, who won the presidency, but not by a lot, right? Yes, he won by 3 percentage points and 3 million votes. But if you start breaking down state by state, yeah, Donald Trump actually did quite well. He outperformed 2016 in a number of states, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, I believe. You start looking at this, he lost by less than half a percentage point, or maybe a little bit more than half a percentage point. This is close. And these are major swing states, the battleground states, which we all look to every 4 years as to who's going to elect the president. So for Biden, he's going to have to move to the center to sort of pull over those Trump voters, right? Because if he wants to be reelected, and I do think he wants to run for reelection 4 years from now, contrary to all the chatter that he's one and done, as they say. How do you deal with that? So it's a centrist president. It's a Republican slim majority in the Senate, where 2 or 3 or 4 key Republicans and Democrats are very moderate and become a power base, which basically forces both sides to cut deals, and a more moderate centrist House. This is an alignment, and it's a message clearly from voters that they want a centrist split government, and they want to see things get done.
So Frank, I agree with all that assessment, but that's a good point to move to one of the questions we have in our chat room. So I agree 100% with that, the implications of what the voters have done, which is we have a very evenly divided Congress, a slight majority of the Democrats in the House and a slight majority likely for the Republicans in the Senate. The presidential race was reasonably close. But then the more progressive wing of the Democrat Party has to decide how they respond to this result now. And so they've already been making some noise in the press to try to keep pushing a progressive agenda, contrary to what voters signaled by moving towards more to the center. So the question is in the chat room, and then I'm going to expand on it. The specific question is there any chance that those more progressive Democrats actually split off and form a third party? But more broadly, apart from that specific scenario, how does that more progressive wing of the Democrats respond to this? Do they then kind of acknowledge that the country's not quite ready for their particular progressive agenda and themselves move towards the center? Or do they keep trying to push the Democrats left to try to, maintain the agenda that they went into the election with?
Well, I think it's going to be a period of rebuilding for the progressives and reevaluating. I think it would be cataclysmic for them if they broke off to start their own party. because they'd be tiny and nobody would factor them in anything in the House or the Senate, right? It's always more constructive politically to be inside the tent than outside the tent, unless that tent is completely poisonous and you, for moral reasons, don't want to be a member of it. But I don't know how that would benefit them. I think what's going to be interesting to see in the midterm elections, can they raise money? Can they elect more candidates? Do we see the arguable leader of the progressive wing, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's left an extraordinary imprint on American politics, not to mention the Democratic Party, who has threatened even this past weekend to break off and start a third party? Does she challenge Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, the ranking Democrat in the Senate, which a lot of people are expecting? Does she challenge him in 2022 in a primary? That'd be fascinating to see if she can elevate the game from a House seat and now become a senator from New York, which is, yeah, they're all equal senators, but some are more equal than others. So I don't see them breaking off. They do. I think it would be, as I said, cataclysmic. I think they also have to push, they're going to continue pushing their agenda, because look, there's something to it, whether you agree with it or not. We're clearly dealing with issues of income inequality in this country. But how do you handle it is a different question and answer. We're dealing still with racial issues in this country. No matter from which side of the political spectrum, it's there, right? People wouldn't be in the streets otherwise. And I think you're also dealing with a lot of people that has fostered a good portion of this outside of ingrained bias or whatever, or greed, or whatever you want to say. I think there's a good portion of America that barely was just recovering from the 2008 economic shock. I think back to my grandparents, who look back at the Great Depression as if it was just like an atomic bomb had gone off nearby. It scarred them permanently. And I think for a lot of people that happened. So you're just trying to get back on track from that, and then boom, you're hit with a pandemic. And I just finished talking to another client here who runs a very large non-for-profit in Chicago, and was telling me that does a lot for aiding people in Catholic Charities. To be honest, Chicago, they literally have not one but a number of people who were receiving aid from Catholic Charities in Chicago, who 8 months ago were donating to Catholic Charities. Right? So something's happened here. There's something in between, and I'm an independent analyst. I'm not coming out as a Democrat. There's something going on, and that progressives tapped into that. It's the question of how do you deal with that?
Okay, and then building on that, what one thing that the progressive wing wants is to raise taxes to fund a number of initiatives. Joe Biden has said that under his tax plan, he wants to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, and he wants to raise personal tax rates on people earning over $400,000, which he says is roughly the top 1% of income earners. With a Republican Senate, what are the odds that he can do one of those two things or both of them?
0.
So you would say, and then if let's say it's nothing, so there's no compromise there. What does that mean for his agenda on things like, we were talking earlier about infrastructure, and you said there was some bipartisan support for infrastructure. Does that mean we can pay for it, or do we just borrow more money?
We borrow more money, and it's thank you, Jay Powell. Jay Powell has bring it, more stimulus, bring it. We can handle it. I mean, my goodness, that's like telling a bunch of 6-year-olds, you can, I'm going to drop you off at the candy store. You can have as much as you want, eat as much as you want, and I'll cover the cost. That's what you're telling Congress. Don't worry about deficit. Nobody talks about deficit in Washington anymore. I think it's been legally banned, and every page of the dictionary where deficit shows up, it's missing. Nobody talks about it anymore, right? So, though I'm beginning to see the among the fiscal hawks in the Republican Party in the Senate, the plumage is starting to regrow a bit. But quite frankly, that's what they're going to do. This is a long-term stimulus, and that we don't have to find a way to pay for it because the Fed said they'll cover the cost.
At what point does that become inflationary, though? If we just keep having the Fed print money and buy government bonds?
This is the huge question. and I get this constantly, I don't know. And I'm not certain anybody else seems to have a hard answer. I think everybody for the time being thinks, until 2023, where the Fed has agreed not to raise rates, that somehow we're safe from inflation from that point. But I get this question almost every day, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think most people are just assuming the risk of inflation popping up here is relatively small.
Yeah, that seems to be the current assessment. And what concerns me a little bit is that, like this quantitative easing we've seen for some time now, is not showing up in the CPI, but there is an argument, I think, that it is showing up in asset price inflation, in property prices, in share prices. And you mentioned income inequality. We could talk about wealth inequality. It's arguable that many people that benefit from that quantitative easing are people who own property and who own shares, right? So you could argue that, well, yes, you are doing some stimulus, which keeps more people employed, and maybe keeps their wages a little bit higher than they otherwise would have been. But the flip side is that there is a big benefit to people who already have these risky investment portfolios that are being propped up.
Well, and those very people are looking at these 2 Senate seats in Georgia like nobody's business. I don't think they blink, keep those eyes on the polls down there every day. Because if you do get that Democratic Senate, that's where, and it will come to an issue of sequencing. Our view in talking to the Biden campaign, formed by these senior economic people, if he had a Democratic Senate, he didn't want to touch taxes until the latter part of the year and maybe early 2022. He wanted to focus this first 6 months healing the country. 1, with a vaccine, 2, on what you need for stimulus. Okay. That may be a much more accelerated track now, because you've seen certainly the unemployment numbers from last week, which were so much better than we thought. And it seems that we have a vaccine on the way. So that has taken a lot of energy out of the demand we're hearing in Congress for a $2 trillion stimulus bill. And it may be closer to 500 billion to $1 trillion. Let's see. But if Democrats win, again, this gets back to the progressives question. Progressives will be in a very strong position. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders in the US Senate. And we're not a parliamentary system. Joe Biden can say, I don't want to do this until the end of the year. And they could say, well, quite frankly, and with this, you hear this from progressives and the progressives we talk to, now is the time. Don't rebuild the edifice of our economy as we've known it. Now plug in and rebuild it so we're dealing with income inequality and therefore a massive rewrite of the tax code. And we need a wealth tax, and we need to have a financial transaction tax. And and you're seeing this experiment being played out at the state level, New Jersey with a wealth tax and a financial transaction tax, despite the fact that both NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange said, we're out of New Jersey. The revenue losses just for that alone was massive, but they still push forward. California, New York, they're looking at these things. So there's an incubation thing going on here. And again, if Democrats get the Senate, we believe they will move aggressively to deal with those income inequality and social inequality issues, and primarily through the tax code. Okay,
but suppose that we do have the divided government. Suppose Republicans maintain the Senate, and this is another question in the chat room, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Then this is in 2 parts, and basically what we were talking about just for the discussion. First of all, what common ground is there between the Democrats and Republicans where you might have bipartisan support for any initiatives? And secondly, in the areas where there is no bipartisan support, what initiatives can Biden implement within the absence of that bipartisan support?
Well, first, let's just do a little bit of the backdrop of President-elect Biden and Senate Majority Leader McConnell. So we've been telling clients for months, and our read going into the election was that Biden would win and the Republicans would hold. These are 2 guys that are in each other's heads. These are like 2 old guys in the park who play chess with each other every day, right? They know their moves. They know how they think. They know what they're thinking 2 years from now, right? These are two guys who have sat there together for the better part of 40 years and worked together. And even when he was vice president, worked on a number of issues with McConnell and got it done. So just think of it this way. This is what's interesting about Biden. We've not had a serious, hardcore legislator sitting in the Oval Office since the first term of Richard Nixon. Great respect for Barack Obama. Sorry, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but he was there for about a year before, this gust of political wind just took him and elevated him into the presidential campaign. And that was it. He never moved a piece of major legislation. He never ground out the sausage. This is what Biden and McConnell have done for 40 years together. Look back at that first term historically of Richard Nixon, a former vice president who served in the Senate for decades, had been a congressman, and was incredibly bipartisan in that first term. Interesting, right? Even on foreign policy issues, it was Nixon went to China. It was détente and the bipartisanship there behind that. This is a very interesting dynamic, right? Let's be honest, Donald Trump did not, and I heard this directly from McConnell on three different times. Donald Trump didn't understand how legislation was made. It's not just school of rock. My name is Bill. I live on Capitol Hill. Yeah, that's the core of it, but it is so much more complex. And he never understood that. Now, he did get some things like tax stuff. No. So now you got the two old rocket scientists who know how to make this get done. And it gets to that issue. Sorry for the long answer. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is the big thing that needs to get done. And it needs to get done, and both sides, and I would argue every corner of both parties, whether progressive left or hardcore right wing, want this to get done, because it's not just potholes and rusty bridges anymore. It's global competitiveness, right? I talked to a former governor on Monday, and we were talking about infrastructure. And the first thing out of his mouth was Jeb Bush. Okay, I don't mean to drop names, but just to give some color to this, and I thought this was fascinating, and a guy may run for president. You're a governor and you're trying to entice foreign investment into your state, which governors spend about a third of their day doing. You don't have 5G. You got countries coming in from Europe and Asia that have 5G because the Chinese have been selling it door to door for the last 3 years amazingly well. We don't have it. We've got technology for everything. We've got an app for everything. We don't have app for 5G. We don't have good, strong broadband. So you have to have it to get foreign investment coming in here. You have to get it to counter the Chinese globally, and you have to do it in a much, and then prepare for 6G and beyond. How do you compete with China if you can't meet those basic standards? So broadband becomes a be-all, end-all as a critical component for infrastructure. To the social justice issues and the economic equality issues. Why, if you're living on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska, and why don't you have better broadband so that you have an education system that can compare to a upper middle class kid living in the New York suburbs, or the inner city kid who maybe they got a laptop, but they have pretty crummy broadband in a city. What are we doing? So all of a sudden, to put it crudely, every itch is scratched from every political angle. So broadband becomes a critical component of that, and knowing 5G, which many of the folks on this call probably know the impact that will have. If you're doing smart grids, if you're doing alternate energy, if you're doing high-speed electric bullet trains, for everything, 5G running everything, you have to have that broadband network.
So maybe that's a good segue into energy infrastructure. So Biden ran a platform of an electric vehicle charging grid. He ran in a platform of investing in more low emissions energy generation. Republicans do not appear, from what I've seen, to be amenable to this type of investment. Have I got that wrong? And if I have that wrong, what can Biden get done if the Republicans don't want to be part of that type of infrastructure investment?
Right. So he offers up an infrastructure plan, I would predict late January, early February. and he tries to make it as green as he can. So it's just a question of what shade of green are we going to? For Republicans, if you're looking for a guide where Republicans are going to go, look to the major business trade associations, big and small, right? Look at the Business Roundtable, which represents basically the top 100, 200 biggest companies in America, and look at their embrace of a lot of these things. Well, they can afford that, and they're the ones competing globally. So yes, then go to the National Association of Manufacturers. Where are they? It's a little different. Where's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who represents big, small, and little? And then where's the National Federation of Independent Business, which tends to be the small independent businessman? If there's a consensus reached among those guys and they're signaling to the Republicans, look, guys, we're not worried about too much regulation. It's not going to kill our business. We see this as competitive. There's your sweet spot. That's where your shade of green comes in. Maybe a little bit more, right? Maybe a little bit more. But that's I think one way to modulate, because Republicans, not that they're in business's back pocket, it's just that their view is, we don't want higher taxes, more regulation, cost jobs, and make us non-competitive for the sake of just being cleaner.
I have a question on a different topic, because we've only got 4 minutes left. So I'm going to switch tack. And I will remind participants that once we wrap up in 3 minutes here, we're going to stay on for up to another half an hour, and I'll promote everyone to a panelist who stays on to have like a post-discussion digest of Frank's comments. I've got a question in the chat room about politicization, can barely pronounce it, of the Fed. There are some commentators who are concerned that the Fed is not acting as independently as it probably should, because the Fed has a dual mandate to promote full employment as well as to maintain inflation at a low, consistent level. There is political pressure to place lots of emphasis on its first mandate, maintain full employment, and the Fed is basically out there printing money to stimulate growth. Are you concerned about the politicization of the Fed? And apologies, we have longer than 3 minutes. The webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes, and then we're staying on. So timing's wrong. But do you have any concerns about that politicization of the Fed?
So I've in previous administrations, previous lives, I worked with Jay Powell, and I've known him off and on for better part of 30 years. He is one wily political guy. A lot of people don't see that about him because he's a very nice guy. He's not sleazy, or just the nicest, hardest working guy. But he grew up in Washington, grew up in Potomac, Maryland. The Powells have been their mainstays here, right? Went to Georgetown Prep, blah, blah, blah. Okay. He knows Washington and has really worked it very smartly, both sides of the aisle. Alan Greenspan used to be known as the master politician at the Fed, right? He'd just pick up the phone and call a member of Congress trying to move a piece of legislation. He'd just say, no, literally. He's like, you can't do this. Oh, okay. Drop the legislation. We're not doing it. I mean, that's the way Greenspan used to work. Powell was a variation of that. And so in terms of independence, I think it's been very interesting that, one, President Trump's attacking him over the past several years has solidified his bona fides with Democrats. I was in the George Bush Sr. and even Reagan administration with Jay, right? It solidified his bona fides and independence with Democrats. And then secondly, and he's not doing this for personal political reasons, but he's also a very bipartisan guy. That think of two things that he has done where he has talked about income inequality and what the Fed needs to focus on that. One that it's preempting Democrats who are trying to put a brand new legislative legal mandate to look at that as part of what the Fed's required to do as a third leg. He has even, I remember 2 years ago, he got a question about climate change from a senator. And he said, well, Senator, I'm not prepared to, at the moment, to give you a lengthy response because we only got 2 minutes. Can I send you a written response, which is the common blow off for anybody testifying from government. Instead comes this long letter, which you can get publicly. All of a sudden you realize the Federal Reserve, out of every federal government agency, has done a massive amount of studying of climate potential impact on the markets, what the monetary policy could be impacted. And you even saw Lael Brainerd giving a speech on this late last week as well. So he is seen as forward-looking, and I think he has figured out how to maneuver around the politics. Last thing, though, that I think has been fascinating, that has been completely unremarked upon, is when the first, second, and third stimulus bills were being done in the Senate, and they were haggling and fighting and couldn't get things done. Powell wanted legislative relief to allow him to launch in each case, some new program that the Fed was running, whether mainstream lending or anything else. This is what is very interesting, and from an economic and Fed historical perspective, he front ran Congress. He sat there, and every case, like, these guys are squabbling, I'm just going to launch it. And he did not have legal authority to do it. And he did it. To which I called up a friend of mine who's a senior advisor to Senate Majority Mitch McConnell. I said, is Jay in trouble here? I mean, he just front ran you guys. And the response was, we all collectively decided to look the other way, and thank God Jay did it. Wow. Wow.
Okay, well, given that the Fed has been like very active in this pandemic situation we've had, and given that like Congress basically, in terms of relief packages to businesses and individuals, basically checked out a few months ago in the election. What you touched on earlier about the prospects for more stimulus relief from Congress. And you basically said, well, the incentive there is less now, given that we've got some good news on the vaccine. We've had one announcement from Pfizer with some great results on a vaccine. Is there likely, or what are the odds that even though we've got some promising news on a vaccine, that there is further action from the House of Representatives and the Senate on COVID? Or do you think they're just done and they're just going to wait it out and see what happens in terms of vaccines?
Well, this has been a very interesting, intense backroom economic policy fight between Senate Republicans and House Democrats, which really hasn't gotten a lot of airing as to what's going on there. There's two issues. First, one issue that nobody talks about, that Republicans, it's the hill that they have been prepared to die on, Senate Republicans. They want liability protection provisions, right? McConnell proposed 4-year, basically, I think it was December of 19 to January of 2024, wanted very broad liability protections for businesses, right? As they're bringing employees back in and customers coming in, oh, I got COVID, class action. I went to XYZ department store, I got COVID. How do you prove it? It's all, right? Democrats wouldn't have any of it. And interestingly enough, Donald Trump never pushed for it. In fact, the first time he was asked about it, I want to say back in May or June, in a press conference, oh, I'm opposed to that. People should be allowed to sue, which, collective mass heart attacks on the Senate side. He walked back from that, but he never pushed it, which for Republicans was like, I'm not doing. So that has to be addressed. The second big issue gets the economic debate, and I'm not endorsing what they have to say, but I think they put a lot of actual statistical data into it in the debate. Go back and look at the Wall Street Journal editorial page talking about stimulus, and what Republicans are charging is nothing more than a wealth transfer, right? Because meaning Democrats looking for more aid for states and cities, and Republicans saying, whoa, 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 New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, we Senate Republicans look at you states, those states, in our view, you were fiscally profligate before COVID hit. Now you're in a mess. You've been more locked down than everybody else. We gave you billions of dollars and you keep coming back for more. We're not doing that because we're looking here at Texas, our boys in Texas and Florida and Georgia. They got hit hard by COVID, but they're not asking for bailouts. So we see this as a wealth transfer and we're not doing it. And until those states do something, we're not giving anything. And then add to that, what I mentioned earlier, you're seeing significant changes in tax policy in New York, New Jersey, California, and Republicans don't want to, in the Senate, don't want to, they don't want to reward that. So how do you deal with this? Because the states and cities do need money, but you've got resistant Republicans who arguably have retained the Senate, campaigning in their home states against this quote unquote wealth transfer. So where does that get fixed? I don't know. I don't know. Is there some deal to be done here where Republicans allow move on a tax front and lift the caps on the deductibility of state and local taxes as a stimulative measure for these blue states that have gotten really hit hard in terms of revenue because of that? I don't know. Could you do that? It'd be a big grand bargain. What do Republicans get in return for that from Biden and Pelosi? I don't know. But I just don't see big multi-trillion dollar packages coming down the line here, particularly with the unemployment numbers where they are, with the vaccine, and with Republicans sitting in the Senate.
Yeah, it does seem that if in September and October, like, there was no agreement here, like, it's hard to see there being an agreement in January, February, and March where they suddenly come together. It may be the only prospect of that is that if the agreement can be more narrowly focused. It seems that, like, from the Democrat side, that there were many people asking for things to be part of the package, which you could argue were not necessarily economic relief, right? So the Democrats have an argument that there should be changes to the way people can enroll to vote, right? And that sort of thing was part of the COVID relief package. So that's just one example where you could say, well, is that really part of economic relief, or is that a social agenda? And why does it necessarily have to be in this bill as a potential point of argument? But they do seem to be a long way apart on the liability protection, as well as the state relief issue. I have a question in the chat room that sort of follows on from that. What about the first budget of the Biden administration? Is there a chance of having a budget produced according to a plain vanilla timetable, or if we go to continuing resolution, because that takes many months to reach agreement? What do you think about the time frame at which a budget agreement would be released in the Biden administration?
I think there's a high probability we go to continuing resolution in the next 3 weeks here, right? Because Republicans are moving to pass that during the lame duck. But if you're Pelosi and the Democrats in the House, let's hold this up and negotiate this next year when Biden's in place, right? And maybe there's something we can get more of that we don't see in the budget. They may get it done. They may get it done. Again, it's a little hard to gauge the level of strength that Pelosi may have at this point. I mean, she's still strong. Nobody's going to take her out, even though there's grumblings of running somebody against her for speaker. That's not going to happen. Or she may just say, let's get this done, because there's a lot of money in there for HHS spending, et cetera, that is COVID relief in and of itself. So we're having a hard time reading that right now, because they've just picked it back up this past Thursday and Friday, and there's a lot of moving pieces. But longer term, I think it's going to be the budget going forward for a Biden administration back to climate. I think he sees that as the legacy issue, right? Signing Paris Climate Accord, getting America focused, shifted, and moving towards being emissions neutral by 2050. That gets directly to your budget. What is every federal agency and department getting? And what are they going to be required to help meet this? This is the dramatic shift. It's not some aspirational thing anymore. It is the lens we look through. It is the avenue we must travel through on everything in the federal government.
And which executive actions can he take first on climate change? Is he going to, like, rejoining the Paris Accord is the easy one, because you don't actually have to do anything on day one after you sign that agreement. Is he going to reimpose vehicle emission standards? Is he going to reimpose standards on particular emissions? Do you know what's the first handful of executive orders on climate that he can do?
Well, I think all of those things come into play very quickly. And he can order agencies to do that, and or with new people at the EPA, that they pass new rulemaking that reverse the rulemakings of the Trump administration. But those take time, right? You've got to get an EPA administrator confirmed by the US Senate. So nobody who's too hardcore left need apply, forget it, right? So, and Biden being an old Senate bull, he doesn't want to do what Trump, it just drove him crazy. We know this for a fact, that Trump had all these people, still has all these people who are in acting positions, right? No, this is disrespectful to the Senate. The Senate needs to do something. We need to work this out. So yeah, he's going to push as hard as he can on these things. It's going to take time, and it's going to take the regulatory action of the environmental regulators, whether it's EPA, FERC, energy, wherever, or even the transportation department. Like, he's designated them as more of a climate. He's creating sort of a sort of a list of those agencies are going to be critical to this, that will be able to move from a regulatory perspective, knowing that you're not going to be able to do it legislatively. But again, those take time, months, if not a year or two.
Right. Can you tell us a bit more about, we talk about the EPA, and we talk about these people in acting positions, including at the EPA. When Trump tore up the Clean Power Plan, the executive actions put in place by President Obama, which mandated to states you have to reduce your emissions to a particular threshold compared to a past baseline. I know that in Michigan, that the utilities, once that Clean Power Plan was torn up, they didn't actually change their investment plans. So they were switching from coal-fired generation to gas-fired generation as a transition towards more renewable energy. Under the Clean Power Plan that was required, when that was torn up, they didn't abandon those plans. They just kept on the same path. So they seem to be making the bet that we don't know who's going to be in the White House at any given moment. But if you accept that these emissions contribute substantially to global warming, you're inevitably going to end up on a very similar pathway. We can't change 50-year investment policy as these executive orders come and go. So I guess my question is, what these things take time to change. What has changed under the Trump administration on climate change policy that has been so substantial that it can't just be unwound and we continue roughly on the same path that we were a few years ago?
Not much, right? I'm not an expert in all the details, but I do know, I was briefed on this even 3 weeks ago. Not much. It's like a rugby scrum, just sort of moving back and forth, right? And quite frankly, the states have learned how to arbitrage this. You just gave the perfect example, that the states understand that this is going to be the play in Washington, D.C., but there is this avenue in which you can maneuver and make your long-term plans, and they're planning accordingly. And that's the fascinating thing to see here, right? The independence of the states, that they're just doing what they need to do and what they want to do. And if a president writes an executive order and it comes under an executive order, it can be overridden by the next executive order.
Do any of your colleagues at Deutsche Bank have views on the new battery technology and how fast this can improve the transition to very low emission source of energy? Because that is the big, we talk about move from oil and coal-fired generation to gas-fired generation as a transition. And the only reason that's needed is because we need the guaranteed supply that gas-fired power plants can produce, as opposed to the intermittent supply from wind and solar. Your colleagues at Deutsche Bank, what are they saying about the progress towards batteries to mitigate, to go away from gas being that intermittent step?
I confess I haven't looked at anything either at Deutsche Bank or DWS. I know our guys have probably written more about that. I've been so consumed with election stuff for 3 months, so I'm not up to speed where I should be. But I will say this, I think there's one other fascinating play here in terms of federal spending and shifting over to that. That's creation of Space Force. Everybody laughs about it, right? It's Steve Carell on Space Force on Netflix, right? This is massive. This is frickin' massive, right? Donald Trump creates a whole new branch of the military that's 100% technology driven. And you're going to be pouring trillions of dollars of money in for R&D that the spin-offs commercially and personally are going to be massive. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. I know his brother works at the Pentagon and moved over to Space Force. I said, what's Bobby up to? He says, oh, he just finished the prototype for the flying car. What? Yeah, no, it works. What do you mean a flying car? I'm like, what, gas? No. Special batteries. So the government's like racing ahead. And the point of the flying car is imagine a flying armored personnel carrier, right? We saw the horror in Afghanistan and Iraq of guys traveling along in strikers or whatever and getting blown up and maimed. Why are we driving when we can fly at a low altitude or high altitude and move them over water, right? All this is all part of Space Force. The money that is going in, nobody's paying attention to this. And you look at who's the biggest winner of this so far? Elon Musk. Elon Musk, right? He just launched the first successful Space Force rocket that went up and came back down. And who's his biggest competitor in this space? Jeff Bezos. I mean, my weirdo prediction, because I sound like a space nerd and I'm not, because science was the worst class. The nuns used to just turn my desk around in science class and say, just behave yourself and we'll give you a decent grade. Look, where we're going with this, there is federal money pouring into this, that it's not just a private sector thing anymore. I mean, my prediction is Elon Musk, my weirdo prediction, I was going to say, I think Tesla and automobiles is going to be an afterthought 10 years from now. What he's done for military contracting and therefore commercial contracting, same thing with Bezos. That's going to be the game changer.
That seems to be what's baked into the Tesla share price, is a play on batteries and rockets as opposed to the vehicles. But I'm glad you brought up tech, because our next question in the chat room is antitrust. So does the Biden have, first of all, any plans to be more forceful on antitrust regulations on tech companies? And secondly, even if he is more forceful, what can he do?
So a couple of things here. Tech is getting it from all sides in Washington, but also not just Washington, right? It's all 50 state attorney generals have ganged up here running antitrust investigations. And let's not forget the power of the state attorney generals. Look what they did to big tobacco when they pooled their resources and capabilities. It just overwhelmed big tobacco. I think this is coming for big tech. So you've got different things here. You've got an antitrust, specifically to your question about Biden, you've got an antitrust cases now that are coming or have come out of the Justice Department. I don't think those change. They don't go away. What's interesting, it may be under Bill Barr's watch or any other political appointee or nominee. These are run by career people. And the antitrust division, having been at the Justice Department many years ago, was fascinating. 2/3 of the antitrust division aren't lawyers, they're economists. Pretty interesting. So they really do their work on this. I think it continues apace. I don't think there's any reversal of course. If anything, there may be more emphasis on this. I got to tell you also, in a regulatory perspective, I always get questions about Hunter Biden and what's the real deal there and everything else. I don't know. I'm not going to get into it because I just can't. I don't know the details. Poor Hunter, poor Joe Biden, whatever. The real loser out of that whole thing, Facebook and Twitter, massively lost because, wait a minute, you're not putting people up. You're not letting people post stories from the New York Post that broke this. I think that falls under Section 203 of the FCC. So those guys are going to get it one way or the other. They're going to be your content providers and editors. So here comes the regulation for you. And Jack Dorsey, with all due respect, didn't show a lot of respect to that hearing and really ticked off both sides of the aisle. Really ticked them off in his behavior in that hearing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that they necessarily have become those content providers and editors as opposed to a platform, because they're necessarily forced to, right? If no one is going to intervene to tell the users of the platform like what is misinformation versus truth, people who can do it. You're right. You can't have a regulator would just not have the capacity to do that review. Right. So the tech companies themselves have to do the reviews. So they are inevitably heading down that pathway of being content providers. Let's talk about two other specific companies. So we have the Google antitrust suit. So Google is charged with running an illegal monopoly in search, and there's no action against Amazon, but Amazon, just on today's Wall Street Journal, the EU says it's violated laws on competition. And in the lead up to the presidential election, Elizabeth Warren campaigned on a platform of wanting to break up Amazon because of its potential use of data to sell its own product lines and take advantage of what works well and what doesn't. So any specific comments on the Google lawsuit potentially running an illegal monopoly in search, and secondly on the Amazon use of data to basically screen what products work and what don't, which it denies, and the potential implications for Amazon?
So the Amazon case, not being an antitrust expert, and I've actually gone back and I just checked out of the library, being a nerd, the great book on antitrust by the late Judge Robert Bork, the antitrust paradox, which really explains how hard it is to bring these cases, is great. It's a great primer. You can't buy it. It's actually, if you go on Amazon, well, that's interesting. You go on Amazon, it's like $1,000 a copy, so it's very hard to get. Look, if you're Amazon, you got that problem, and you've got the state attorney generals. Wow, that's explosive, because that's all your little local businesses in your state complaining to the AG, who, sorry, I don't mean to be insulting to state attorney generals, but their collective organization is the National Association of Governors. NAG is the acronym. It's also known as the National Association of Aspiring Governors. And so a lot of these AGs like to run for governor. Boy, if you're getting the hometown crowd telling you I got a problem with Amazon, then Amazon's going to have a problem. And with Google, the fascinating thing about that, a couple of thoughts about that. One, you've got these giant companies, and sitting here in Washington, this is sort of a footnote, but it's one of those, I think, important footnotes. How do they interact in Washington? Google has made a ton of money on campaign contributions, not contributions, but campaigns hiring them, right? Because their capability to identify people in certain neighborhoods or swing voters. I'm running for Congress as a Democrat. I want to reach these people, and every time they pop up and they're on Google to search something, there's Frank Kelly for Congress. You can do that. Google's made a lot. So meaning Congress knows the potency of Google. Now, there's no friends there. That scares them. The second thing is they really don't have Washington offices. Look what Microsoft went through the antitrust side. And they had a Washington office who really could be eyes and ears and warn the businesses, guys, they're coming for you if you keep this up. You need to understand you got a problem. Google, some of these other guys, they got Washington offices. They spend a lot of money, but they don't work it. They don't truly understand. I'd point to Facebook when they rolled out Libra. That is the case study of never approaching Congress with a bright new idea that you haven't really sort of gently, quietly massaged into it. Look when they rolled out Libra. Look, we've got this new alternate way of currency, right? A cryptocurrency that's not tied to the US dollar. Oh, and it's headquartered in Switzerland. You should have seen the faces, seriously, the faces, members of the House Financial Services Committee, Senate Banking Committee. You think you're going to do what? What? No. right? You got to work these things. And I would argue Twitter, Facebook, Google, yeah, they've got presences, but what have you done to understand how the system works? And I think they've really been lagging there.
But what would you say to the argument that you could say, okay, so you've been lagging there, but their share prices are through the roof, right? So they may say, yes, that is not necessarily the way that other people do business, but if we try to do business that way, that may have detrimental effects on the way we've achieved our success, right? And so Facebook over many years has adopted a strategy of saying, we're going to ask for forgiveness later, right? And every couple of years, Mr. Zuckerberg appears before a Senate committee, says, we made a mistake, I'm really sorry, we're going to do better. And this is a regular pattern. And so, is there any reason to think that Facebook or Twitter would change that model to be more proactive about working with the Senate or the House of Representatives on new ideas? Or are they just going to continue to say, we're going to hit you with new things, sometimes it's going to work terribly, but that's been our business model to date, and we became really rich in doing that?
I think that there's probably from what I pick up around town, there's significant debate, discussion of that happening within those businesses. Now, I say this as an observer, but I also lived through this. I was the former head of government affairs many, many moons ago at Charles Schwab and Company in the late 90s and early 2000s. We were trading 90% of our trades at the time were online. You can imagine what a threat that was back then to the retail broker, and the complaints and the fear. And you quickly realize you would go in to talk to members of Congress, and they would hear something of like, people are going to be, they're going to go online and they press the wrong button and all their money disappears, or you really had to get in there and work with every member of Congress, with the staff over and over again, evangelizing, here's how this works. I remember flying around the country doing little town halls with members of Congress because they were hearing from constituents the concern about the internet and what was happening, right? And you had to explain, no, this is not how it works, and privacy issues, everything else. It takes a lot of shoe leather to get it done. So I think that debate is being discussed. You can't do it by marketing, can't do it by advertising, you can't do it by promising or just showing up. You can't do later, because I think later is now.
Well, I think, yeah, so let's switch to two other tech companies, Lyft and Uber. Like they would counter that, well, we are just going to launch, we're going to disrupt transport. And if we get this done fast enough, we can prove that it's so beneficial because we're going to halve the cost of transportation compared to a taxi. Those companies have successfully lobbied to have Proposition 22 passed in California, which means that its drivers will be independent contractors. They won't be employees, but they will receive some benefits like health benefits and a minimum wage while driving the vehicle, which makes them receive some of the benefits of employees, but they're contractors. We've got like 2 minutes to go. Any thoughts about Lyft and Uber and whether that has implications for their broader operations?
Well, I can't, not being an analyst of either, I couldn't speak to that and wouldn't try and pretend to be. But I will say this, I followed what happened in California. Fascinating, the adoptability, the movement of both companies, right? Realizing that whether you're regulated or not, we're all regulated. Government can get on you anytime, and you've got to adopt to that and move. And I think fascinating to see how they did that, which required, if you're doing a proposition in California, the get out the vote effort and the education downstream to the average Californian, it takes a lot of time, money, effort, and being smart about it. But I think it's a great case study on how to adopt in a regulatory environment.
Well, Frank, we have hit an hour. Thank you very much for your time. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. For anyone who wants to stay on for any post Frank Kelly discussion, please stay on for up to half an hour. You can stay on at your leisure. But thanks again, and enjoy what the week brings.
Hang in, everybody. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, mate. See ya.
Bye.